Welcome back to the Sepctor Creative channel. I'm your host, Scott Toy Guru Netilich, former brand manager for Masters of the Universe and lifelong Masters of the Universe toy collector. And today, if you hadn't guessed it by the scrolling image, we're talking about family trees, and in particular, the family tree from the Masters of the Universe brand, because it is full of awesome coolness and secrets and mysteries, and well, it's actually kind of like a lot like Castle Grayskull, full of mystery and power. So let's dive in to the family tree on Masters of the Universe because, like other brands, the main character tends to have relationships with kind of everybody. And sometimes that's like, really? How in the world could Spider-Man be related in some way to, not blood related, but to every villain? But yeah, he kind of has relationships with everybody somehow through Peter Parker, and it's very similar in Masters of the Universe. And the brand has evolved over the years, and it has had many, many different stories, and, other things evolve and change form. I'm most familiar with the history of cheese graters and how they turn from one type to another, but we're going to focus on the 2000X series, which was also picked up by Masters of the Universe Classics, and that's what the family tree document, which showed up a few moments ago, was drawn up for, was in support of this show by Mattel and Mike Young Productions. So let's dive in and do a little Motu history. So to do the family tree, first we have to look at the creation of the universe, which was a giant wave of energy set through the universe, creating everything. And of course, to protect this giant wave of energy, it was put into a sword called the Sword of He being the Trollan word for power, and entrusted to a great warrior, Hero, who went throughout the galaxy fighting evil. So while Hero is out there fighting evil with the Sword of He, with the power of the universe inside, King Grayskull, who was firmly established in the 2000X series as the ancestor of He-Man, is on Eternia, also fighting the good fight in the name of, all that's good out there. And while he was created in the 2000X series, he does make an appearance way back in 1982 in the very first mini-comics, where you see him in shadow there on the throne of Castle Grayskull. And he later is seen as the spirit of Castle Grayskull. So whether or not the 2000X series picked up on this, either way, he now became a flesh and blood character seen on screen, along with his queen, Vina, who was Queen Grayskull, because we couldn't copyright the name Vina because of a Russian doll that had that name. That's how toys work. So the toy became Queen Grayskull. Hey, it works. All right, so you've got King and Queen Grayskull, but let's go back to that sword. See, there was a reason I put that in there. So a great villain called Gorpo, the Unnamed One, tried to steal the sword, and that's why the overlords of Tralla, that's Orko's people, the Trollans, decided to entrust it to that great warrior Hero. And eventually Hero found his way to Eternia. It's a whole other battle with the Horde Empire and a techno-organic virus, and there's a whole other story there. The point is, he winds up on Eternia, he dies, saving King Grayskull's life, and passes the sword to King Grayskull. And King Grayskull uses it to chop off Hordak's arm. Note the blue blood there, which is why he has blue skin on Etheria. The blood rises to the surface. And King Grayskull drains the power of the universe from the sword into an orb to protect it, and puts it inside of his newly built castle, Castle Grayskull, which will now protect the orb, and the sword can now harmonize with this orb because the power used to be in the sword. But it's now easier to protect inside the castle, locked away. So King Grayskull goes on to continue to defend Eternia from all threats, foreign and domestic, and one of those foreign threats is Hordak, who's back for revenge. He kills King Grayskull, but his bloodline lives on in a daughter because Vina was pregnant when he passed on. And she would go on to become the next sorceress and train others to take over the role. But what about the Sword of He? Well, it was passed on through the generations to great warriors known as the He-Men. Each warrior, the greatest of his generation, would guard the sword, and the sword, being magical, would change color based on the warrior that was holding it. And that's why the sword comes in lots of fun colors, from candy cane to pink, blue, and camouflage. Okay, maybe not, but it does explain why Faker, when he holds the sword, it turns orange, and when Skeletor has it, it turns purple. And speaking of Skeletor, that's a perfect time to skip forward a couple thousand years while the He-Men were guarding the Sword of He, and we get to Keldor, Prince of Eternia. So Keldor, the blue-skin guy there, is the half-brother of Randor, You probably know him as King Randor from Filmation in 2000X. So that family tree that I talked about earlier, this is one of the many secrets it reveals, is that Miro, who was Randor's father, had a previous wife who was a Gar, a blue-skinned warrior, or blue-skinned maiden. A maiden can be a warrior, and they had a son, Keldor. Miro would then go on to marry again after Keldor's mother passed away and had Randor with another woman, his second wife. So Randor and Keldor grew up together as brothers. This was actually first introduced into the lore way back in '87 with the Search for Keldor mini-comic. It was picked up in the 2000X series, but if you go back to the mini-comic, there are hints and discussions where Randor's looking for his long-lost brother, and Skeletor says, "We can never let him discover that secret," because the secret is that Skeletor is Keldor. Keldor, Skeletor. So, yeah, I mean, hopefully kids were putting that together, because it wasn't quite spelled out, but it was very, very strongly hinted at, as that was what Keldor's secret was, and why Randor couldn't find him. All right, so Keldor and Randor grow up together in the royal palace, and they, as princes of the land, are great warriors. They fight together in a series of battles known as the Great Unrest, which was the royal family against the evil wizard Marzo, who is commanding armies of beasts and monsters and all sorts of mayhem. During one of the battles of the Great Unrest, Marzo opens up a portal to Despondos, the evil dimension, and throws King Miro into it, leaving Eternia kingless and without a leader. Well, Marzo is defeated, but a king still needs to reign, and as firstborn, it should have passed to Keldor. But there is a lot of discrimination against the blue-skinned race, the Gar. And when Randor's mother, the Queen Mother, the Dowager Queen, is suddenly killed, and there's definitely a hint on the cover of this mini-comic that a certain intergalactic villain was kind of pulling the strings there and manipulating events. It wasn't quite Keldor that killed her, but he kind of thinks he did. And because of that, he is riddled with guilt. Randor finds him kneeling over the dead body of his mother, Randor's mother, Keldor's stepmother, and with the crowd outside already prejudiced against the blue-skinned Gar race, Keldor's race, Randor realizes he has to banish Keldor before the crowd finds out that Keldor is what everyone thinks responsible for the Queen Mother's death. And by banishing him, he's actually saving Keldor's life, because otherwise the crowd would, be out for blood. And Keldor becomes an outcast. He doesn't see it this way as saving his life. He sees it as Randor stealing his birthright. So he wanders Eternia looking for power and revenge, and he finds the temple of Hordak. So Hordak being the one who is kind of manipulating events, very much kind of like a Emperor Palpatine from the Star Wars prequels. And Hordak trains Keldor in the dark arts and teaches him magic, but in order to be even more powerful, he needs to have a magical weapon. So Keldor goes to the city of Zalatia and manages to get the Havoc Staff from the Guardian, the Faceless One, who is the guardian of the Havoc Staff. And now with the Havoc Staff in hand, Keldor is much more powerful, can have much more access to magic, because the Havoc Staff touched the Star Seed, the source of all magic, and he starts recruiting other villains and outcasts and misfits to his side, whether through money, bribery, or just promises of power, and slowly builds up his own personal army of what he calls the Evil Warriors. All right, so he leads them in a giant battle against his half-brother Randor, who also has his own army, known as the Masters of the Universe, and they have a giant clash, which is the opening battle of the 2000X series in the first episode. And it's actually one of the best episodes of the show. If you've never seen it, I highly recommend it. Brother against brother, all is on the table. So during this battle, Keldor attempts to kill Randor by throwing an acid vial at him. Randor blocks the shot, and the acid vial falls back and splats in Keldor's face. And what do you think this does? Well, it mortally wounds him, and he flees back to the Temple of Hordak, begging his old master to save his life, which Hordak does by combining Keldor with the interdimensional being Demo Man. who enhances Keldor's power, and this process saves his life. So Demo Man doesn't take him over, it's just, like +5 magic, if you will. He just gives him increased power and keeps him alive, but his face now turns into a skull, which of course cramps his relationship with Evil Lyn, who of course fell in love with handsome Keldor and now is repulsed by Skeletor with a floating skull as a face. But eventually they reconcile and they do have a son together known as Skeletine. He wears a mask as an homage to his father, but he doesn't have a skull face. He just wants revenge in his father's name. And that's sort of a story for another time, and the battle is known as the End of Wars, when Skeletine fights He-Man's son, Dare. We'll get to that at the end. Alright, so let's go back to Vina. So we had Queen Grayskull and King Grayskull back in Preternia, thousands of years ago, and she would pass on the role of sorceress to her daughter, and then so forth and so on to many other guardians. Not necessarily in her bloodline, just a great, powerful woman who could do this. And eventually, the woman recruited is Teela Na, and Teela Na is made the new sorceress of Grayskull. This is now in He-Man's time, the time of the Filmation series in 2000X. So this is the sorceress that we sort of all know and love and are familiar with as like the sorceress, if you will, as opposed to there were hundreds of sorceresses, much like there were hundreds of He-Men between King Grayskull and He-Man's time. During one of her many walkabouts, the sorceress falls in love with a fallen warrior who is bandaged both in his face and in his arm, and they get married, and she has a great responsibility because she needs to guard Castle Grayskull and the orb, but she knows that her child, by this bandaged warrior, is going to be destined to be the next sorceress, which she names her Teela, after, a variation of her name, Teela Na. So she asks Man-at-Arms, who is the head of Eternia's standing army in the Royal Palace, and an ally of hers. He saved her life years ago, and he agrees to raise Teela as his own daughter, and to never tell her about her true heritage until the right time. So he raises her in both books and weapons and everything she'll need to know in order to be the star of a Netflix series. And while she grows up to be captain of the guard, she absolutely looks on Man-at-Arms as her father, never really questioning her true heritage. And of course, what would a story be if it wasn't full of drama? And eventually she does start questioning things, especially when Prince Adam comes of age and they start to have romantic interest. And Man-at-Arms realizes she's eventually going to need to know the truth about her origins. Some of this happens when she receives a blood transfusion from her mother and starts to receive some of the powers, such as she gains psychic powers that temporarily allow her to see into people's heads. So that's Teela's mother and not stepfather, but foster father. What about her biological father? Who is that bandaged man with a bandaged arm? Well, the arm is the big hint. And this was part of 2000X, and it was documented in the official family tree that Mattel and Mike Young put out in part of the 2000X series. So it's Fisto. Fisto is the actual father of Teela, and Fisto is Man-at-Arms' brother. So note the red hair and the red hair on Teela. So Man-at-Arms' brother is actually Teela's biological father, which eventually she would have found out in 2000X, but we never got to that because the show is canceled before its time. Alright, turning over now to the royal family, the last part of our video. So we talked about Miro and King Randor, his second-born son. So with Keldor banished, Randor becomes king. It's good to be the king. And of course, every good king needs a good queen, and that was going to be Marlena. So Marlena is a very interesting character because she's one of the only characters not from Eternia. She is from the planet Earth. Earth? It means dirt. Anyway, so she's from this other planet, and she is a astronaut. She is a space explorer, and she flies a ship called the Rainbow Warrior through a warp field, an interdimensional portal, etc., etc. There's some other videos about it on this channel, and the long story short is she winds up crashing. Now, she is named after another famous astronaut Hence, her last name is Glenn. She is meant to be a descendant. But she crash lands on Eternia, is rescued by King Randor from the wreck, and of course, because it's a wonderful fairy tale, they immediately fall in love, and she decides to stay on Eternia instead of trying to find her way back to Earth. I mean, Earth. You know what I'm saying. Now, they have 2 children together after they are legally wed, because this is a children's property, and we know them as the royal family of Eternia. So we have Randor, we have Marlena, and their 2 twins, Adam and Adora, which you probably know very well because they're otherwise known as the Twin Warriors of Power, aka He-Man, the most powerful man in the universe, and She-Ra, the most powerful woman in the universe. And they each got their own series in the 80s, and then the rights were sold to Hallmark, and then Entertainment Rights and Classic Media, DreamWorks, Universal, and let's just say they're no longer part of the same property anymore, and the rights have been split, and that's a shame, because they were meant to be brother and sister. Maybe the rights will combine again one day. Who knows? So He-Man grows up, obviously, and after a space adventure comes back to Eternia and finds his long-lost love, Teela, who has now succeeded her mother as sorceress, because, well, the sorceress was bitten by King Hiss. It's a long story. And she reveals to him that before he left for outer space, they had a child together. And He-Man kind of knew this in the back of his head. It is a biological child, and, they were also married, because it's a kid's property. And their son, Dare, grows up, takes the power sword, and becomes the new champion of Eternia named Hero. And he screams out, "By the power of He-Man, I am Hero." And again, magical transformation. Hero helps lead the heroic masters of the universe in the 3rd Ultimate Battleground, which is one of 3 giant battles in Eternia history involving many, many of the action figures and variants and accessories and vehicles in the line, because, it is a toy line after all. And eventually, he fights Skeletine, the son of Skeletor and Evil-Lyn, in a battle known as the End of Wars. And that pretty much brings us to the end of the family tree and all of the secrets that it contained. And that, my friends, is where the story ends. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. Do share this video with others who might find it interesting, because it helps the channel a ton. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.